Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Civil War Monitors Behind the Lines. I'm your host, David Thompson. It's my pleasure today to be joined by Dr. James Marten, who is the chair of the History Department at Marquette University and the recent author of the Ubiquitous Mr. Tanner in the Civil War Monitors spring issue. So, Dr. Marten, thanks so much for joining us today.
Yes, my pleasure.
Now, I'm assuming for many of our readers, certainly for me, this was their first introduction to James Tanner, who seems to be a rather fascinating character. So I wonder, for those maybe who haven't had a chance to pick up the issue, if you could give us just a brief overview of who this gentleman really was.
Well, as I've been saying, he's the most famous person you've never heard of. I'm pretty sure if you would have asked most Northerners at least, he's actually pretty popular in the South too. In the 1890s, who the Corporal was, they would have said James Tanner or Jim Tanner. He was, and he never held an elective office. He didn't write any books or memoirs. He was famous because he gave lots and lots and lots of speeches all over the country. He was a Chautauqua speaker. He had an agent in New York on the Lyceum circuit, the Star Lyceum Bureau. It was his agency. He was one of the most famous veterans in America. There were many famous soldiers who were veterans. He's not a famous soldier. He had a very short and inglorious career as a soldier, but he was really famous for being a veteran and advocating veterans' issues, mainly the pension. He was the commissioner of pensions, which was one of the biggest offices in the federal government in the 1880s and 90s, for about 7 months. And so that was part of his fame, but mainly he was famous for being a veteran.
Now, how did you actually come across Tanner? Was it previous research or for another book, or what was it for you?
I saw a little bit about him when I wrote Sing Not War, which is a general book about Northern and Southern veterans, came out 2-3 years ago. And because he was pension commissioner is why I came across him then. Pensions were an extremely controversial subject during the time. And he was a favorite target of Puck magazine, which was a satiric magazine. They hated the pension system. And on 2 or 3 occasions, there were cover stories about Tanner and cartoons, full-color cartoons, painting him as a spendthrift, as corrupt, as not supposed personally corrupt, but as being someone who was the head of a corrupt agency. And there was one in particular. He's standing in front of the Treasury building, and he's got like Roman toga on, and he has this cornucopia, with a long tail snaking back to the Treasury building, and from it spilling coins and money into the hands of grasping pensioners and old soldiers below him. And he's got this satanic grin on his face. I found out later that he actually wrote a letter to Puck the next week complaining about not the issue, about how he looked. And so they published his letter, which was very good-natured, and a photograph of him when he was a very handsome guy, and so he took it in good stride. But that's really my exposure to him. Was I have a couple of paragraphs at most about him in Sing Not War.
Now, in the earlier portions of this article, you kind of set the stage for Tanner being involved in a rather intimate moment, and that being the death of Lincoln, allegedly.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could speak just a little bit to that, because I would imagine this is going to factor into his rise in popularity and kind of notoriety amongst soldiers and civilians alike, that eventually gets him on the radar of individuals who can get him into offices like the Pensions Bureau.
Actually not.
Okay.
I'll tell the story in a minute.
Yeah.
But I think that's completely separate.
Okay.
Most people didn't know about it until he was famous. Tanner lost, the reason he comes to anyone's attention really is that as an 18-year-old, he loses the bottom third of both legs at Second Manassas. He volunteers to upstate New York when he's 17. He doesn't really see any combat, as far as I can tell. He's on the peninsula with that campaign. He's in a very bad regiment, the 87th New York. And they're one of the regiments during the Second Manassas campaign, which is sort of scooped up by Stonewall Jackson. They were divided. They're guarding bridges. 300 of them sort of melt away, and so the regiment doesn't survive the battle. It's put into another regiment. Tanner himself is not captured, and he and 10 or 12 other guys, he's a corporal by this time, an 18-year-old corporal, attach themselves to a Pennsylvania unit. And during the second day of fighting, just before, or really just as the Union line is collapsing, a shell bursts over the line. The regiment had been asked to lie down on the reverse hill, on a reverse hill. So they're not in combat yet. And this shell burst, he's really the only casualty along the line. And shrapnel, shreds the bottom part of both legs. They amputate, they're kind of hanging by shreds, they amputate them. He ends up spending a horrendous 10 days in a Confederate hospital, goes on for treatment. Anyway, he gets back to upstate New York by late in the fall of 1862, and the first thing he does is learn how to do stenography at a school in Syracuse. And so he ends up in Washington then, working in the War Department. He lives next door to the Peterson House, which is the house they take the president to when he's shot in April 1865. You might remember that Stanton sort of takes charge, after war, Stanton takes charge of the scene and starts taking testimony, was going too slowly. And someone knows that Tanner knows stenography and that he lives next door, so they call him in. And so he spends the night until about 6 in the morning taking testimony. And those are actually very famous notes in shorthand. The Union League in Philadelphia owned. He presented them to the Union League back when he was famous in the 1890s. Now, he's left out of all the pictures of the deathbed, but he claims to have been there because he was done with his work. They were kind of witnessing the last breaths of Lincoln. Excuse me. And he writes about it in a letter to a friend over the next few days. And really no one disputed the fact that he was there. Just that people just forgot it. But you won't hear about it until, I think, the 1890s. An article comes out, and it's copied in lots of newspapers. It suggests at one point that Robert Lincoln is the last person alive who saw Lincoln die. That's Lincoln's son. But in fact, no. Corporal Tanner was there, and so there's articles following up on that. And so, in fact, his presence there, he went back home that fall. He went to law school, or read law. He didn't go to law school, he read law back in just west of Albany is where he was living. And no one made the connection. He doesn't, there are no letters. He didn't leave a large letter. He wrote thousands of letters, I'm sure. They don't exist anywhere. And so, as far as I know, he never talked about it until these articles started coming out late in the century about the survivors of the assassination. So it's a brush with fame. He's famous for it later on, but it doesn't have anything to do with his career.
So how then does he advocate for veterans? He's obviously in a position where he's dispensing money, as you point out, for about 7 months before he has to leave. But what was he doing to advance an agenda that obviously he has a vested interest in?
Well, he moves to New York and to Brooklyn in the late 1860s, and for 20 years he lives in Brooklyn. His most important job is as tax collector for the city of Brooklyn. And that's a Republican-appointed position, He runs for office a few times, never makes it. But he also begins, he joins the GAR, Grand Army of the Republic, very early. He eventually belongs to one of the most famous posts in Brooklyn, the U.S. Grant Post. But it's through the GAR that he begins advocating for veterans' issues, especially pensions. And so as the GAR rises, especially in the late 70s and 1880s, it sort of has it comes back from almost extinction, At that point, he's already been the commander of the New York branch of the GAR. In the 1870s, he got the Soldiers' Home built in Bath, New York, as commander. He was actually served 2 terms, which is unprecedented. And he begins advocating for pensions then. At the same time, the GAR is kind of rising, and so those two things together, the pension issue and the GAR as a promoter of pensions, gives him a platform on which he speaks. And again, it's about this time, the mid-1880s, late 1880s, just before he's pension commissioner. He starts speaking all over the country. He speaks in every Republican campaign. New York, Indiana, the soldier states like Kansas, Indiana, Illinois, and New York, which are big swing states. This is a time when politics, the parties are very closely matched, in terms of numbers. And some of these states can make a huge difference. And he's often credited with, winning certain states. Whether or not that's true now, who knows, but they're states with large soldier populations, and he campaigns there. And so he becomes very useful to the party. The party depends on the soldiers' votes. Soldiers are voting in favor of, people who vote for bigger pensions. And so that's how Tanner, really gets people's attention.
Does he personally have any aspirations for elected office that you can? Again, there's not this treasure trove of letters that you can build off of. But do you get a sense that he was ever pursued personally by the party?
Only locally. He did run for sheriff of Kings County on Long Island. He always, as they say, he ran ahead of the ticket. It was a heavily Democratic area at that point. And he always got more votes than the Republican candidates in other offices, but he lost that election about 1884, I think. He ran for state legislature once, I believe, and for city council, but he was never elected. He's living over at Park Slope, which is the area just west of Prospect Park now, which is very Tony, brownstone. It is again now. And he was living over there, and I think part of where he lived is why he never got elected to anything, because the Republicans just didn't win elections over in Brooklyn.
Now, you allude to, towards the end of the article, a publication that Tanner put out with the American Red Cross. And I think you've referenced at least some of the circumstances behind his wounding, but you mentioned in your piece here that it's a very difficult read, and it's almost a brutally honest read. I wonder if you could just elaborate a little bit kind of on what he actually is saying in this, and really what makes it so powerful.
Sure. The Red Cross was a very important thing to him, partly because his wife was an activist with the Red Cross. During the Spanish-American War, she was very active in the Red Cross. Their son served in the Philippines during during that conflict and afterwards. His wife died in a car accident in 1906, but he kind of carried on. The tradition was it was rechartered by Congress about that time, and he was one of the original board members of that newly chartered Red Cross, and so he knew Clara Barton, and he's a pretty important guy with that. And so he'd raised money for it and so forth. In 1916, they published this two-part article. He'd written other versions of it. I can't remember if this one came first or the other one came first, but he doesn't write a lot of stuff, but this is one of the things he wrote. And it really is just a narrative about his service and his wounding and his treatment. And so it covers about 4 months of his life from that day at Second Manassas to the 10 days where he's really being untreated with 2 amputated legs in this steamy Virginia tent, basically, where they give him water and not much else. He's eventually exchanged. He goes to an Army hospital at Fairfax, Virginia, an old seminary, which is still a seminary. And there they save his life. His amputations at the time don't really give him problems. He'll have several surgeries over the course of his life on his stumps. They'll take a couple more inches off in the 1890s, which is covered in the newspapers, Tanner's condition. But his bed sores were so bad that they used an acid treatment where they just rubbed acid on his bed sores. And in fact, that's what almost killed him. They got infected. They got gangrene. And it's the worst moment of his life, as you might imagine. I don't know how long it lasts, but the treatment, I looked it up, and he doesn't do much detail, but the treatment includes injecting as well as pouring hydrochloric acid, I believe, on a back. And it cures him. He's fine. But that's what he talks about. And the whole issue, sort of what frames the article, the editor of the magazine in his introduction says, sort of frames it for us. we should be prepared for the next war. We should never go to war unprepared to take care of our wounded soldiers, because this is the ramp up to the First World War, the Great War. The United States won't be in for another year, but it's a huge part of the debate, political debate that year, and the Red Cross is gearing up for it. Whether it's this war or some other war, we owe our men more than Corporal Tanner had. And so it's pretty gruesome and very straightforward, and it's a great service he performed, I think, to the Red Cross. One of the things he this isn't about the Red Cross, but there's this 11-volume medical history of the Civil War that was published afterwards, because they're always collecting specimens and reports and so forth. And it was used as a textbook right up through the First World War for military, anything, just any sort of gunshot, treatment. He appears in it in a footnote as one of 7 men to survive a double amputation of the kind that he survived. So he actually, right away, when he comes out of the war, he enters the books as a unusual specimen.
Now, finally, Dr. Marten, this article is part of a larger monograph, America's Corporal, James Tanner and War and Peace, that's coming out with the University of Georgia Press this fall. I wonder, kind of, if you could perhaps share with us a bit of an arc of how you view that whole work coming together, how perhaps this fits into your larger examination of this man.
The article suggests something about fame and celebrity. I go into a little more detail in the book. And the book is sort of divided up into periods, but there are different parts of his life are important for different reasons. So you have the Republican Party, you have the GAR, reconciliation, you have the pension issue, and so forth. He's also a claims agent, makes lots of money as a claims agent. And then in the end of his life, for 30 years, he's the Register of Wills in Washington, D.C. Lives in a house in DuPont Circle, which is still there, with his daughters. Both of them work in the government. They never marry, and one of them, they work into the 1950s, one of them, for the U.S. government. So there's lots there, but sort of underlying all of the book is that he's a famous guy we've never heard of, and why is that? Why is he not survived? And so the article kind of touches more on that. I think I give 3 examples of things he should be famous for, ways that he expressed himself. Like I talked a fair amount about the Red Cross article. But then I compare him to Buffalo Bill Cody, who's a contemporary, also very famous, kind of similar ages, and they both had this kind of odd experience during the Civil War. Cody becomes much more famous and remains famous. Everyone knows who Buffalo Bill is. And I suggest in the article and in the book in more detail that the reason is Buffalo Bill recalled a past that was romantic, the West, the past that everyone could share in no matter where they lived. That was a positive reflection of American values. This is sort of the stereotype of the westward expansion and so forth. Tanner's version of the past demands something of other people. You can never repay the saviors of the Union enough. You still owe them something. It's a painful past, in fact. Even though he promotes reconciliation and patriotism, he's very much a pro World War I, pro everything. He's very much a saber rattler, kind of a Teddy Roosevelt type of guy in a way. But mainly he reminds people of this kind of painful past that by the 1890s, turn of the century, they don't really want to think about that much anymore. And I argue that's one reason we don't know about it anymore. And in the end, he didn't write any books or articles. There's no papers. He actually gave an address on the radio. One of his last speeches at a GAR convention in Boston, 1924. I would give anything to hear that, but apparently there are no recordings available of that. But he lived a long life and saw a lot of stuff, but no one knows him. I actually polled some historian friends. Have you ever heard of Corporal Tanner? One person had a remote idea, but she had written a book about veterans, and he was like a note in there.
Well, I think we'll leave it at that. Dr.
Okay.
Marten, thank you so much for taking some time to speak with us. Again, there's an article in the most recent issue of the Monitor, the Ubiquitous Mr. Tanner. But if that whets your appetite, then hold on for this fall when America's Corporal, James Tanner and War and Peace comes out with UGA Press, and perhaps we can have you back on again. So thanks so much, Dr. Marten. We appreciate it, and hope to have you back on again.
My pleasure. Thanks.